20 episodes ago, I walked through my house and asked one question. How many of your systems have no backup? I counted. I wrote the number down. 31 single points of failure. Not theoretical, not hypothetical, real dependencies in my actual house, on my actual infrastructure, where if one thing broke, power, water, supply chain, communication, heat, the next layer was not ready. 31 places where the system had no graceful degradation, no fallback, no plan B. Today I am going to answer that question. For my house, with real numbers, and then I am going to give you the tools to answer it for yours. This is the Season 1 finale, 20 episodes, 7 systems. This video is the complete audit, what we covered, what changed, what the map looks like now, and what comes next. If you have been with this channel since episode 1, this video is your proof of work. If you are finding this for the first time, this is the fastest way to understand the entire framework in one sitting, and then use it. Before I do the recap, I want to be honest about something. A season finale could be a highlight reel. The best moments, the most dramatic failures, the biggest numbers. That is not what this is. This is an engineering review, dry in places, precise in others. It covers what worked and what did not, with the same energy for both. Because the methodology does not care about the drama. The methodology cares about the failure modes. If you want the drama, the individual episodes have it. This video is the map. Let me set the terms. Over this season, I audited 7 layers of household resilience. I am calling them layers because that is what they are, stacked dependencies. Each layer depends on the layers below it. Medical care requires that the patient is warm. Communication requires that the radio has power. Food storage requires that the water supply for cooking is available. You cannot audit the layers independently and get accurate results. You have to see them as a system, where a failure in one layer can cascade into the layer above it. That framing comes from IT infrastructure, where it is called a dependency map. I applied it to a house. The result was 31 single points of failure. Here is how that number changed over 20 episodes. Layer 1, power. Episode 1 started here because power is the root dependency. Every other layer in the house assumes power is available. Pull the power and you lose heat control, water pumping, refrigeration, communications charging, lighting, and every piece of electronic medical equipment in the building. Power is not one of 7 equal layers. Power is the foundation. Audit it first. The audit found 4 single points of failure. Single grid connection with no backup. A generator that had not been tested in 14 months. A battery bank rated for capacity but never load tested under real draw. And a fuel storage situation that would have lasted approximately 18 hours at real consumption. The key finding from the power layer was not the hardware. The hardware was fixable with money and time. The key finding was that I had been confusing specification numbers with operational numbers. The battery bank is rated for X watt-hours. That is not how many watt-hours I actually get in real conditions, at real temperature, under real load. The spec sheet is the number the manufacturer measured at optimal conditions. My conditions are not optimal. The real number is lower. How much lower depends on factors the spec sheet does not advertise. Temperature coefficient, discharge rate, depth of discharge degradation, inverter efficiency loss. I was planning against the spec number. I needed to plan against the real number. I call this the specification lie, and it showed up in every single layer of this audit. Not because manufacturers are dishonest, because specs measure performance at ideal conditions, and you will never be operating at ideal conditions. The gap between spec and real is a variable that every system in your house carries, silently, until you test it. The methodology that came out of the power audit. Load test everything. Do not accept rated capacity as operational capacity. Run the system under your actual load profile and measure what you actually get. Then plan to that number with a 20% margin below it. If your plan requires being above that margin, your plan will fail. Power started with 4 single points of failure. Addressed 3. 1 open item, the fuel rotation schedule, which I have designed but not yet fully implemented as a consistent habit. That is a process failure, not a hardware failure. It is on the list. Layer 2. Water. Water was the most uncomfortable audit of the season. Not because the findings were bad, because the findings were embarrassing. I had been storing water against a standard that I had never questioned because it is so widely repeated that it feels credible. 1 gallon per person per day, 3 days minimum. That is the FEMA recommendation. That recommendation has been largely unchanged since it was first published. It was designed to be achievable, not adequate. The real findings from the water audit: my stored volume was adequate for the FEMA scenario and completely inadequate for any realistic extended scenario. My filter capacity had never been tested for the water source I would actually use in an emergency. Not the tap, which would be off, but the rain barrel and the nearby water sources I had identified on a map but never actually filtered from. My water collection system had been designed but not tested under actual throughput conditions, and my hygiene water budget was based on comfortable household habits, not on the real consumption I measured during the 72-hour off-grid test in episode 17, where my actual use was 40% higher than my estimate. 40%. Not a rounding error. 40% is the gap between how careful you think you are and how careful you actually are when you are cold, tired, and have been doing this for 16 hours straight. The water audit produced the concept of the comfort gradient, the gap between how you behave when resources are plentiful and how you actually consume when you are rationing under stress. Every water budget I had built assumed I would behave like a careful, rested, motivated planner. The 72-hour test showed me I behaved like a slightly exhausted person at 2 in the morning, trying to remember the measurement procedure. The budgets needed to be rebuilt around the second person, not the first. Add a minimum 15% buffer to every water calculation you make. Not for waste, for the version of you that exists after day 2 of an actual emergency. Water also introduced what I now call the single path problem at the most visible scale. If the municipal supply is off, and my filter breaks, and my stored reserve is exhausted, there is no water. One path to the outcome. In every well-designed system, critical functions have at least 2 paths. Water, before the audit, had 1. The audit added a second and created a documented process for identifying a third. Water started with 6 single points of failure. Addressed 5. 1 open item. Testing the rainwater collection throughput under real precipitation conditions. This requires weather I cannot schedule. The test is ready. I am waiting on the weather. Layer 3. Food. The food layer was the surprise of the season. Not because it went wrong. Because it went right. Completely, consistently right. Across the entire 72-hour live test in episode 17, the food system was the only component that performed exactly to spec, without modification, without deviation, without a single failure. That result was not an accident. It was the result of applying more structural redundancy to this layer than to any other layer in the house. I spent a lot of time in episode 7 and the live test understanding why. The answer is structural. The food system had more redundancy than any other component in the house. Multiple meal types, no single critical ingredients, no recipes that required a combination of items that could fail together. Pre-measured portions, so there were no calculation decisions under cognitive load. Rotation system, so I always knew which items were oldest and what needed replacing. Calorie-dense backup layer independent of the primary rotation. Every design principle I had used in server architecture, redundancy, modularity, no single critical path, automated rotation, applied to food, and produced a system that just worked. The lesson from the food audit is transferable. The reason this layer succeeded where others struggled is not that food is simpler than power or water. It is that I designed the food layer as if failure were the default state and the system had to work anyway. I designed the other layers as if function were the default state and failure were the exception to plan around. Those are fundamentally different design philosophies, and they produce fundamentally different results under real conditions. The number of ways a system can fail is inversely related to the number of parallel paths it has to succeed. The food system had 5 parallel paths. If any one item was unavailable, 4 others covered the gap. The water system had 1 path. The communication system, before I rebuilt it, had 1 path. The food system taught me the template, and then I applied it backward to everything else. If you are only going to do one thing from this season, design your food storage with the same philosophy applied to critical infrastructure. No single points of failure, tested rotation, and a minimum of 3 independent backup options at every critical step. Food. 0 single points of failure after the audit. This is the only layer with a clean score. I am not touching it. Layer 4. Communications. Communications was the most underrated layer before the audit and became one of the most interesting after it. The finding was stark. In a scenario where cell networks were down, which is among the first things that happen in any serious regional disruption, I had no way to receive information or communicate with anyone outside my immediate physical location. None. My entire communication infrastructure was cell-dependent. 1 single point of failure, and it was not even my infrastructure. It belonged to a carrier. That framing, infrastructure you own versus infrastructure you rent, is the central concept from the communications audit. Everything on a cell network is rented. You do not control the tower, the backhaul, the routing, or the priority queue. In a disruption, priority goes to emergency services, then government, then infrastructure operators. Your call is in the queue, somewhere behind all of those. In a major event, your call may not complete at all. Your text may queue for hours. Your data may simply stop. The communications audit introduced a layered response to this problem. Layer 0, receive only. NOAA, a weather radio, shortwave receiver, local emergency broadcast capability. These require no two-way infrastructure, no license, no active network. They just listen. You know what is happening before you have to make any decision about what to do about it. This is the first thing to add to any communications kit, and it costs less than dinner at a restaurant. Layer 1, short-range two-way. Family radio service radios. Bubble pack walkie-talkies that everyone already has in a drawer somewhere. Range measured in city blocks under real urban conditions, not the marketing claim of 35 miles measured across a mountain range with line of sight. But city blocks is enough to coordinate with immediate neighbors. Useful. Cheap. Already in the drawer. Layer 2, medium-range mesh network. This is the Meshtastic LoRa hardware covered in episodes 11 and 12. The technology creates an ad hoc radio mesh where each node relays messages for all other nodes in range. Your message travels through the network the same way a packet travels through the internet, node to node until it reaches its destination. With a critical difference from the internet, this network runs on hardware you own, on spectrum you can use without a license at low power, with no dependency on infrastructure that someone else controls. It goes down only when the hardware goes down. It does not get overloaded by a million people trying to use it simultaneously. It does not get prioritized away from you in favor of institutions with better contracts. The mesh network finding was the biggest systems insight of the communications audit. This technology is not useful at the individual scale. One node has range measured in kilometers under good conditions. One node can communicate with other nodes in its direct range. 10 nodes in a neighborhood create a mesh with meaningful area coverage. 20 nodes cover a full residential district. The capability scales with adoption. This is not a solo preparedness project. This is a community infrastructure project. And that insight connects directly to Layer 7. Communications. Started with 5 single points of failure. Addressed 4. 1 open item. The neighborhood mesh network is deployed, but not at critical mass for full utility. That is an ongoing coordination project. Progress is measurable. The trend is positive. Layer 5. Heat. Heat was the layer most people skip. I almost skipped it. It does not feel like a systems problem in the same way power does. Power is obviously infrastructure. Heat feels like comfort. It is not comfort. In winter, in a house that loses heat at the rate mine does, heat failure is a survival problem within a time frame that is shorter than most people assume. The audit forced me to put numbers on it. The critical number from the heat audit: time to uninhabitable. Not time to uncomfortable. Time to where the coldest and most vulnerable occupants, children, elderly, anyone with a chronic illness, face health risk. That number, for my house, in my climate, had the temperatures I measured during a cold snap last January, with heating off as a test. Roughly 4 hours from comfortable to at risk for vulnerable occupants. 4 hours from grid failure to medical risk if I have no backup. That is not a wide window. The audit found 3 failure points. Primary heat source, forced air, gas-powered, was dependent on electricity for the ignition system and the blower. No electricity, no heat, regardless of whether the gas was flowing. This is a single point of failure that hid behind an assumption I had never tested. Does the furnace run without grid power? The answer is no. Most modern forced air systems are the same. The gas is available, the ignition and the blower are not. The secondary heat capacity, space heaters, was electric only. No grid power, no secondary heat either. Both layers had the same root dependency. This is the design failure that appears everywhere in household infrastructure when you audit it. You think you have 2 systems, and you discover they share a common dependency that makes them effectively one system under failure conditions. The thermal envelope audit was the 3rd finding, and the one that required the most uncomfortable thinking. Not a device failure, but a design failure. My house loses heat at a rate I had not measured. Knowing the loss rate, how many degrees per hour in cold weather with no active heat source, is essential to calculating how long any backup heating solution needs to run and at what capacity. Without that number, any backup heat calculation is a guess. I measured it across 3 overnight tests with heating off. The result changed the sizing of my backup solution significantly. A solution I thought was adequate was actually insufficient by approximately 40%. That is the specification lie appearing again in thermal physics. The designated warm room concept came out of the heat audit. You cannot economically heat an entire house with backup solutions, but you can heat one room to a survivable temperature with modest resources. Selecting that room in advance, understanding its thermal characteristics, and pre-configuring it for occupation under extended cold weather events, that is the system design decision that converts a dangerous heat failure into a manageable inconvenience. Heat started with 3 single points of failure, addressed 2. 1 open item, a minor thermal improvement to the designated warm room. Home improvement project, budgeted, and the schedule for next month. Layer 6, medical. Medical was the hardest layer to audit and produced the finding I least expected. I went into the medical audit assuming the gap was supplies. The standard prepper answer: more bandages, more antibiotics, More everything. The audit showed the gap was not supplies. The gap was knowledge, and the gap was scenario assumptions. On knowledge, I had a well-stocked kit. I did not have the training to use it under stress, in low light, with hands that were not cooperating, without walking through a procedure on a phone screen. There is a term in emergency medicine for this: shelf knowledge. You know where the information is, you have not done the thing. Shelf knowledge does not transfer under real conditions. The assessment in episode 14, where I actually tried to run through the tourniquet application procedure with cold hands in limited light, made this concrete in about 90 seconds. I knew the procedure. I could not execute it at an acceptable speed under simulated conditions. The solution is not reading better guides. The solution is practicing the physical procedures until they are motor memory, not shelf knowledge. On scenario assumptions, most medical kit guides are designed around trauma, the dramatic, visible injuries that drive the visual language of survival media. Bleeding, burns, fractures. But the medical events most likely to affect me in a real extended disruption are not trauma. They are prescription medication management when pharmacies are closed or supply chains are disrupted, chronic condition management under degraded care access, illness prevention and management without immediate professional access, and the mental health load of sustained stress over multi-week timelines. My kit was excellent for the low-probability dramatic events and weak for the high-probability mundane ones. The audit inverted the priority. The third medical finding was the shelf life audit. Every consumable in a medical kit has an expiration date. The expiration date is not a marketing construct. It is a stability guarantee. After that date, the manufacturer no longer guarantees that the product performs as specified. Some items degrade slowly and remain functional for years past expiration. Others degrade in ways that are not visible. The safest approach, and the one I adopted after the audit, is document the purchase date and expiration date of every consumable item in the kit, build a rotation schedule, and check the kit on a fixed calendar date every 6 months. The same rotation logic I applied to food applied to medical. Consistent methodology produces consistent results. Medical started with 7 single points of failure, addressed 5. 2 open items. The training certification is scheduled, not yet completed. The prescription medication buffer is in coordination with my physician. Both are in motion. Layer 7, Community. Episode 19 covered this layer in depth, and I want to give it the framing it deserves in this recap, because it was the layer I most resisted, and the layer that changed my thinking most fundamentally. The resistance was an engineering argument. Community as a resilience layer sounds like it introduces uncontrollable variables. You build your system, you test it, you know your numbers. Other people do not know their numbers. Depending on infrastructure you cannot audit, that is a reliability compromise. I could not quantify it. That made me uncomfortable. The audit broke that resistance with a specific calculation. I mapped the tasks required to maintain all 7 household systems simultaneously during an extended event. The power monitoring, the water rotation, the filter maintenance, the food preparation, the communication watch schedule, the medical check, the fuel management, the thermal monitoring. I calculated the time and attention load as if I were the only person executing all of them, continuously, for an extended period. The result was clear. Beyond approximately 5 days of continuous solo operation, the cognitive load of running 7 systems simultaneously while managing the ambient stress of an actual emergency situation exceeds what one person can sustain without degraded performance. Not dramatically, gradually. Decision quality declines, mistakes increase, systems fall behind their maintenance schedule. Errors that would be caught early in a rested state go unnoticed. The distributed resilience finding was precise, Community is not a social nicety. Community is a technical requirement for systems that need to operate over extended time horizons. A network of households with overlapping but differentiated capabilities. One household with superior medical supplies and training, another with generator capacity and fuel storage, another with a large food stockpile, another with communications hardware and the skills to operate it, is more robust than any single equally resourced household. For the same reason, a distributed server cluster is more robust than a single powerful server. Not because the individual nodes are better, because the network has no single point of failure at the node level. One node goes down and the network routes around it. The methodology shift from the community audit: stop auditing a household and start auditing a network. The household audit tells you your individual resilience. The network audit tells you your actual resilience. The unit of analysis changed after episode 19. Everything I think about preparedness now starts from the network. Community started with 6 single points of failure at the network level. Addressed 2. 4 open items, all social rather than technical. This is the layer with the longest timeline. Network infrastructure is built over years, not weeks. That is not a failure of urgency. That is the correct timescale for building something durable. Now I want to show you the full map. Episode 1, 31 single points of failure across 7 layers. Most of them hidden behind assumptions I had never tested. Most of them invisible until the audit forced me to look at them directly. Episode 20, 7 open items remaining, 24 addressed. The map is not clean. 7 open items is not a passing grade on a system that is supposed to protect your life. But 6 of those 7 have active plans and known completion timelines. The 7th, the weather-dependent water test, is waiting on conditions I cannot control. The difference between a system that is under construction and a system that is neglected is not how many open items remain. It is whether the open items are visible, prioritized, and being worked on. Mine are. The delta from 31 to 7 is not the point of the season. The point is the methodology that produced that delta. Because the methodology is what you can use, not my specific numbers, your specific numbers. Here is the audit method. This is exactly how I ran it. You can run it in one afternoon. Step 1. Draw the 7 layers. Power, water, food, communications, heat, medical, community. These are the 7 life support systems of any household. Literally draw them, on paper, in a notebook, as nodes on a map. Make them visible. The act of drawing them is the beginning of the audit. Step 2. For each layer, answer one question before you open a single cabinet or drawer. What does this system require in order to function? Not what do I have, what does the system require? Power requires a source, a storage mechanism, a distribution path, and a control system. Water requires a primary supply, a filtration method, a storage volume, a consumption budget, and a delivery mechanism. Work through the requirements before you inventory your equipment. Requirements first, inventory second. This sequence matters. If you start with inventory, you will organize around what you have. If you start with requirements, you will discover what you are missing. Step 3. For each requirement, trace the failure. Ask, what happens if this specific requirement is unavailable? Not generally unavailable, specifically unavailable. Not, what if the power goes out, but what if the power goes out at 2 in the morning in January, when it is -12 outside, and I have been awake for 16 hours already? The specificity of the failure scenario changes the quality of the audit. General scenarios produce general findings. Specific scenarios produce specific findings that you can actually act on. Step 4. Test everything you plan to rely on. Not functionally, behaviorally. Functional testing asks, does this work? Behavioral testing asks, what does this do over time, under real conditions, when I am not watching it carefully? The flashlight that failed at hour 11 in episode 17 passed functional testing. It failed behavioral testing, the test where you leave it in storage state for 30 hours and then check whether it still has power. That test takes 30 hours and requires no skill. I did not run it. The dark room at 2 in the morning was the test instead. Run the behavioral test before the emergency does. Step 5. Mark every single path. Every place in your system where there is one way to reach a working outcome, one path, no alternative, is a single point of failure. Count them. Write the number down. Sit with the number for a moment. That number is the accurate measure of your vulnerability, not your stockpile inventory. Step 6. Prioritize by the intersection of probability and severity. A failure that is likely and catastrophic gets addressed first. A failure that is unlikely and manageable gets addressed last. Most of the household audit failures cluster in the middle. Medium probability, medium severity. The heat failure in winter is not medium probability, it is high probability given any serious grid disruption in a cold climate. The communication failure is not medium severity, it is high severity because it affects your ability to coordinate every other response. Find where your high probability and high severity items overlap. Start there. Step 7, and this is the one most people skip, run the test. Not a tabletop exercise, not a thought experiment, a real test, in real conditions, with real consequences for errors that are uncomfortable but not dangerous. The 72-hour off-grid test in episode 17 found 4 failure points that 20 hours of careful planning had not found. The test found them in 11 hours. You cannot think your way to the real failure points. You have to experience them. That is the full audit methodology. 7 steps, 1 afternoon for the initial pass. The checklist linked in the pinned comment walks through every layer with specific questions, a scoring system, and a prioritization matrix. Download it, print it, walk through your house with it in your hand. I want to end with something honest about where I am. I am not done. I want to say that clearly because there is a failure mode that appears in every domain where someone documents their work in public. You start to believe that the documentation is the work. The map is not the territory. The checklist is not the capability. 20 episodes of building systems does not mean the systems will not fail in ways I have not anticipated. The test proved that. Fully tested equipment, fully documented plan, failure at hour 11 from a mechanism I had not tested for. What I have after 20 episodes is a better map, not a complete map. A map with fewer blank areas than the map I started with. A map that will be proven wrong in some places when the real test comes. Not the test I designed, but the test that arrives without a schedule. I know more places where it will be wrong. I know more ways to find the places I have not found yet. That is what the methodology gives you, not certainty, better uncertainty. You know where your gaps are. You have prioritized them. You have a plan. The audit is done. Not mine, yours. I showed you the method, the layers, the dependencies, the failure modes. Now it is yours. Download the checklist. Walk through your house. Write down your numbers. Not the spec sheet numbers, the real ones. And when you are done, tell me. Drop your number in the comments. How many single points of failure did you find? Not to compare, to close the loop. Because you did the work, and the work is worth acknowledging. Season 2 starts with the one system I deliberately left out of this entire season. I covered power, water, food, communications, heat, medical, community, 7 layers, complete audit across all 7. There is an 8th layer. I left it out because I am not ready to cover it. Because every time I start mapping it, the dependencies go deeper than anything in this season. Because the failure modes are not personal in the same way, they are systemic in a way that makes individual preparation feel inadequate. Because I have been sitting with what I know about this system for several months, and I still do not have a clean methodology for it. I know the problem. I have not solved the problem well enough to teach it yet. I am not going to tell you what it is. Subscribe, because when I am ready, and I am close, Season 2 opens with it. The one system that terrifies me more than all 7 combined. You are not ready, but you will be.